Hi everyone, welcome to this new episode of Carolyn Talks, the podcast / YouTube channel where I, your host Carolyn Hines, film critic and journalist, speak to film creatives about their work, the industry, and what inspires them. And this is one of my episodes for the 2023 Sundance Film Festival. And today I am joined by I can't speak, but I'm joined by a composer and musician, Gene Back, to speak about his work in the new it's not just a rom-com, the new dramedy feature film by Randall called Shortcomings. I really enjoyed this film, and I have a lot of questions actually for Gene about the music used in the film. But as usual, before I begin my interviews, I usually like to let my guests say a bit about themselves and what inspired them to go into the field they're in. So for you, Gene, what inspired you to become a film composer, or just a composer in general? Because I saw on your IMDb you also do work for like theaters, and you also do like music writing and composition as well.
Yes. So, my journey as a film composer is a little winding. I really never set out to become a film composer. I think actually you'd be surprised how many film composers don't see that as, their first job or, a career that they envision for themselves. But, I originally come from a classical music background. I'm a violinist by training. And really my composing started quite young. When I was a teenager, early teenager, I started writing songs. And I taught myself guitar and learned how to produce music by myself, and recorded an album in my parents' basement when I was a kid, on these 8 tracks and stuff. And so I guess you could really point to that being the genesis of my journey as a composer. And it really wasn't until after I finished touring with bands and stuff in my early 20s that I actually started to compose for advertising. And that was really kind of the beginning of my journey in terms of composing for media. And because of my skill set as a multi-instrumentalist, and I could record all these different instruments myself, and of course with my classical background, I was able to get gigs that were more on the cinematic side, which was really fortunate for me. And that just naturally led to me doing more film work, short films, independent films. And then it just kind of snowballed from there. And here I am now.
Here you are. And like you said, most composers don't have a linear progression in their careers. And this is so true. I think you're probably the third or the fourth composer I've spoken to, and all 3 of you have said the same thing. Like, you started out doing one thing and ended up doing something else completely different. And you're a multi-instrumentalist, but you also began in classical background. Like, I have to ask this question because me being a fan of classical music, and I used to play the violin back in my younger days.
Oh, no kidding, really?
No kidding. The violin is actually my personal favorite instrument. Out of everything, I love the violin. So I have to ask, what was your favorite classical piece, not only to play, but also to listen to?
Oh, wow. That's like asking me my favorite movie, But favorite piece to play on the violin specifically, or
we can do specifically for the violin, but just in general, since you're a multi-instrumentalist.
Okay, let's see. On the violin, to be perfectly honest, I haven't practiced in a while. Like, my practicing actually comes when I'm recording.
I've not touched a violin in years. So
Yeah. But one of my go-tos is really the solo Bach sonatas and partitas, and although those are multiple pieces, and they all have just individual qualities that I enjoy, but there's something certainly about the sonata in G minor, which is such a meditative piece. And it's something that can be played in so many different ways. And every single time it's a new experience. And I think that can really apply across a lot of Bach pieces, because the way he wrote those pieces aren't very prescriptive in its dynamics and markings and things and articulations. It really just opens up to itself up to interpretation. And for me, it's such a wonderful exercise technically, but also thematically, emotionally, and and as a meditative exercise. It's just one of the best things to play when you just need to escape, for a little bit
I
into
feel
it.
you. Bach is one of mine. There's a piece by Bach, and I'm terrible at remembering the names of music, but there's a piece by Bach, I think it's in G major, so the cello piece, and Yo-Yo Ma plays it often, and it's one of these pieces it feels to me very, depending on the mood you're in, like it can be very sad and somber, and then it just gets me all emotional, and like even Vivaldi's Spring or Autumn, like that, the season series. Whenever I'm feeling emotional and meditative, like that's the series I put on the most. I always play Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and it's just gets me all in the feels and the emotion. But like like you Bach and Vivaldi for me in particular, and of course Beethoven. Like can't go wrong Beethoven. But like I love those pieces where it's open to like there's some composers where when you can't really express their music beyond what they've composed it as. But like for Bach in particular, I find like you can put if you're feeling like somber, you can play a song that's meant to be happy and make it somber because of how he composed his music. So I'm very much like you that way.
Definitely. I love that. I mean, it almost sounds like an expected answer to point to Bach because he's so universally admired and played and performed around the world. But it really is one of just the purest forms of like early-ish classical music that you can play. And there aren't many pieces for solo violin. Most of the time, as a solo instrument, it's accompanied by an orchestra or a piano. But Bach is really one of the few composers, apart from maybe at least in his counterpart at the time was Telemann, who also wrote solo violin pieces, and they're beautiful unto themselves. But beyond that, maybe more modern examples would be a collection of pieces by Eugene Ysaÿe, and it's a Belgian composer. And a romantic composer, and he actually composed a suite of solo violin pieces that were kind of based on Bach's solo violin pieces.
I will have to look
except
him up,
in a more
I'll have to look him up because I don't think I'm familiar with the name. So I will definitely check him out because I'm a huge fan of like violin pieces in particular. I don't know, the violin to me is just the instrument that I really connect to a lot emotionally, and I actually am gonna bring that back to the film Shortcomings, but I'm going to do that a little bit later because there's a composition at the end of the film that I thought was very different to the music that plays at for the beginning of the middle. What am I saying? The three acts of the film, but we'll get to that. So like we started talking about classical music, and I did actually ask you that for a particular reason because like to me, the music that we have now would not exist without classical music. Everything that we have musically originated from particularly classical music, particularly the Baroque era and the Romantic era. Like you can't get past Bach, you can't get past Beethoven, you can't get past Mozart, Handel. For goodness sakes, if you want to get like all introspective, like influence, like some of the most, like you can't have Christmas without the Hallelujah chorus, and you can't have the Hallelujah chorus without Handel. But these musicians have influenced so many filmmakers and as well as so many composers in how they interpret music. Like we have a limited number of notes on the scale, but like I was thinking about this the other night in the car. I was like, we have these finite number of scales, a finite number of notes, but we have like an infinitesimal amount of compositions. And for you as a composer, like coming from the classical training and the background, and then being able to create your own work. I'm so impressed that you as a young person taught yourself the guitar, because the guitar is not an easy instrument to learn at all. But you taught yourself, and then you taught yourself music production. So like taking all of the finiteness of music in the sense that we have this limited number of notes and scores, and how did that influence you into becoming a composer at the beginning? Because you said you started out doing commercials. And I thought that was interesting because that actually made me think of the film Karina. Ray Liotta's character was writing jingles for commercials.
Yes.
And like a lot of people don't really, I don't think, give like the attention that compositions for commercials deserves, because like commercials is very specific. You have to make a very sharp piece of music that has to stick with people and has to make them think of a particular product like 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road. So like coming from your background, going into working commercial, tell me about that part of your career.
Well, I had no idea what I was doing when I got my first commercial gig. And, it's one of those classic stories where somebody asks you, hey, can you knock this out and, send it to me tomorrow morning? And you say, oh, yeah, sure, no problem. And then in the back of your mind, you're like, oh, my God, how the hell am I going to do this? and so, I really, it was a sharp learning curve. Nothing teaches you better, in my opinion, than learning on the job, especially in the creative field, like when you have a deadline or something. And so I was really forced to figure it all out under pressure. And, what I really came to realize, at least composing for commercials, is that you're right. You have to tell a story in such a short period of time, in 15 seconds, 30 seconds, sometimes 90 seconds. And it's about, writing something that sticks with you, whether it's like a tone or a texture or a melody. And, I think one could argue that that's really like the heart of thematic composing, which is what I really gravitate towards now as a film composer. And some of my favorite film composers are thematic composers. The king of thematic composers, John Williams, of course, although, I'm not a John Williams.
I was thinking Hans Zimmer, but, John is pretty good too.
Yeah. And so I've always gravitated, since I was young, I'd be humming melodies and themes from movies, from classic thematic composers. And I just feel like that background and, proclivity towards that style helped me develop, sharp themes for commercials, which is, are like just smaller stories, or movie. I mean, it's a debate, right? Whether you can call that a short form of a film, but they all share the same aspects of storytelling in a way. And so, that's kind of how I approached my thematic composing commercials. And really, once I started moving into film, I just expanded that. And instead of being condensed in 15 seconds or 30 seconds, doing film allows you to expand that and make variations of a theme, that you're not really afforded to in a 30-second format.
Right. And speaking about themes, I noticed this film has a very particular theme, and anything we do very interestingly is you kind of take it into three main eras of music. Right. But before we talk about these three eras of music, which I thought was interesting, because I was like, am I imagining this? And then I have to play back some scenes. I was like, no, it's there. But before we get there, like, talk about working with Randall and how you and Randall got together to work on Shortcomings. And then what was it that he told you at the beginning when he said, this is what I want this film to sound like? It has to have an identity. Beyond the theme, a film has to have a musical identity because it has to fit the story. And then most importantly, it has to fit the characters and then the visual of the film.
Yes. So first of all, Randall is just an absolute joy to work with. And he's become one of my good friends now. And I just cannot tell you how proud and privileged I feel to have worked on this with him, and him entrusting me to deliver the musical story for something that he has worked for over a decade, wow, essentially to make Shortcomings, come to life. And so I just couldn't feel luckier and more grateful. And the way that we actually met was through BAFTA, because I was selected as a BAFTA breakthrough artist. And they had introduced me to him because BAFTA was so great at expanding my network and just setting up meetings with various folks in the industry. And Randall took the meeting right away. He was just like, yeah, let's go. And really, just from that first meeting, we really hit it off, just creatively and personally. And, we had a series of meetings, and he told me about Shortcomings a year before he started production on it.
Okay.
And right when he finished production, we had always been in touch and just updating each other on what's going on. And yeah, we started talking about what he wanted for the score. And he really had a clear direction of what he wanted on sort of a macro level. He was very interested in starting off the movie and ending the movie with lush orchestral cues as a bookend. And the idea behind it is that we start off the movie with this kind of movie within a movie, right? Let's just call it that.
Funny.
Yeah. And creating that musical landscape in an orchestral way that maybe you could even imagine hearing in a movie like that, right? But then we end the movie with an expansion of that same orchestral material, but into something that is actually really purposeful in its unfolding and becoming the full or concluding the full arc of Ben, the main character's arc. Mm-hmm. And so it was really like starting off with an orchestral cue that, one could say, oh, this could be like the score to that movie in a movie. But then that actually transforms and morphs into a much deeper message at the end of the movie, so that it sort of passed the baton to become something else. And then, and then everything else, in between, the film is kind of split up between the Bay Area and New York. Mm-hmm. And so Randall was really interested in having the Bay Area sound like kind of a gritty band and like an indie band, and we're talking sub pop era, early 90s. And that's very much what informed the graphic novel, or at least I know Adrian was very much into that, Tomine, who's the writer of Shortcomings. And so we really wanted to capture that feeling of an indie band, and then that gets more frenetic and bigger as we transition into New York. And so it's just to give that sonic texture that is appropriate for what we see and feel in the Bay Area scenes versus what we feel in New York. Although there is a cohesion in that it all has that indie feel, but with a little bit of quirkiness thrown in there, and I tried to elevate some of the indie feel with a woodwind quartet, and that helped with some of the quirkiness and themes that were built in.
Yeah, I'm going with you. Like I just said, it bookends with like a classical piece, and that classical piece comes a bit more noticeable at the end. But at the beginning of the film, like I just said, it's not really a spoiler, is it? So it kind of references Crazy Rich Asians. But what I thought was interesting what you did with that, because that is kind of, as you said, a film within a film. And that's a film that's referencing another film. But that film, the film that's within Shortcomings, I thought what was interesting with that is that you made it's lush because the setting and the scene is lush, and it has that kind of this big feel. But I thought what was interesting is you added the South Asian musical elements in it, so that even if you hadn't watched Crazy Rich Asians, the instruments, the particular instruments, I'm not sure what it's called, but it's one that sounds like it's something that's being plucked a bit, and it just lets the audience know this film that's being referenced is one that has South Asian elements. So I want you to talk a bit about that, because I thought it was a very smart and a very subtle way of referencing the original film, but also the Asian identity of the original film, because this film is about the Asian American experience, and Crazy Rich Asians is about not only Asian Americans, but South Asian identity as well. So you reference that South Asian identity within the instrumentals itself. So talk about incorporating that into that small little segment that plays in the film, but it can still be recognizable to anyone who knows what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's so interesting you picked up on it. I'm so flattered that you actually did, because it's something, like you said, they are subtle cues, right? Subtle little sprinkles of things that might help a listener or audience member feel like, this feels like it could be, Crazy Rich Asians or something else, or at least in that genre. And funny enough, in terms of the instrumentation, there's some like kind of whimsical uses of tabla, or uh, like you said, plucked elements like pizzicato and sort of syncopated rhythms that
Yeah.
maybe you might hear in a Southeast Asian setting, or context rather. And so that was all very deliberate, but at the same time, I didn't want to go overboard with it, because I was also imagining, how would I maybe compose the music for a Crazy Rich Asians, right? What would my take be
Mm.
on that kind of a score for that kind of a movie?
Yeah.
And so it was a little tongue in cheek, in which in a way playing with the comedy of the movie within a movie, but also at the same time imagining, hey, if I got that score, how would I, approach it
Mm.
orchestrally, in a way that doesn't make a movie like that so, how do I say,
Heavy-handed.
yeah, just like because I think even in any movie, it could be the schlockiest thing ever. I think any movie can benefit from a thoughtful and interesting score,
Mm-hmm.
no matter what. And so it really was a combination of things in my approach for that particular scene.
Right. And you talked about there's these three, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's these three main sounds, and as you said, like these tones for the film, and they have to do with the specific locations that the film takes place in. So there's the Bay Area, where Ben lives with his girlfriend Miko and his best friend Alice. And I noticed that music for that song had a kind of a jazzy, bluesy sound, and there's a lot of horn elements with regards. I think the saxophone in particular takes a very prominent position in the music composition. So talk a bit about using blues and jazz in particular, the sound for the Bay Area, because like I would have like going into the film, you would think more like it would be more like an urban kind of pop kind of song, but you're like, no, it's going to be a jazz song. And the funny thing is, like, the scenes don't really have a particular, well, quote unquote jazzy feel. Like they're not like moody or anything like that, but like the music is kind of like a soft jazz saxophone led composition.
Well, that's very interesting that you hear saxophone there, because there actually wasn't a saxophone in the
That's
score.
the instrument that it sounded like to me, Eric. Could be. It's not. I was like, it's not a trumpet, but it sounded like a saxophone. It's the woodwind. But yeah,
they're the woodwinds, and you're right, and that's so interesting that you identify that as saxophone, because the sax is a reed instrument, and I used the bassoon and oboe quite a bit. And so they are in the same family. And so oftentimes, depending on how it's played, a bassoon or an oboe can sound like an alto sax, and a bassoon can have that very guttural, reedy tone that even a tenor sax can have. So it's very interesting that you picked up on that, and it is a little deceiving because there is a bit of a jazzy feel. Right. And so that was that was really cool actually to hear you say, oh, there's like a bit of a sax and, like the jazzy element. And that's all very much true. And I can tell you that the choice to explore that feel was derived from actually some of my initial sketches for Ben's theme. And Ben's theme, there's a cue called Ben Being Ben. And that really is that encapsulates Ben's curmudgeon-ness and also some of his romantic side. Is really his whole psyche is embedded into this one cue. I don't know if you remember, it's right after Ben and Miko's first big fight.
Yeah, when they're going into the bedroom and he's trying to make up and she's like, I'm not having it. And that's when you really hear it. And I thought it was interesting that you had that for that particular scene, because normally a composition or even that particular sound or the jazz genre would be used more for like a scene where it's more sensual, more sexy, but for them it's more about anger and about annoyance. Like he's annoying the hell out of her and he's frustrating her, and you use this soft jazz to undertone that. So I thought it was a very interesting the choice to make.
Yeah, and you know, where that really where that comes from, and the inspiration was from the film 400 Blows. And you know, that was a very deliberate, you know, choice, in that, you know, I really wanted to pay tribute to Ben's character and what he's about. He's a Criterion film nerd, right?
Yeah.
And so I just thought, what better place to start than the birth of French New Wave? And so there's very interesting pizzicato, like solo violin pizzicato parts in the score of 400 Blows. And also, you know, a lot of those French scores have a jazzy feel. And of course, jazz was very big in Paris during the 20th century. And so a lot of that music is influenced by jazz, or at least in film music. And so I wanted to capture some of the quality of, say, 400 Blows or films like that as a tribute to Ben's character as a Criterion nerd, and just that being a part of his psyche, and that is what's being communicated on screen, because you're not being told left and right that this guy is a total film snob. And so, you know, part of what I at least am interested in film scoring is communicating things that aren't outwardly said in dialogue or in the script. And so it's all very psychological in a way. But yeah, that sort of jazzy-ish feel, you know, there's upright bass, there's vibraphone, which is a very jazzy tone. You know, you don't hear vibraphone a lot outside of a jazz combo. But at the same time, I combined it with violin, with both bowed violin and pizzicato violin, to help create sort of like a weird texture that could feel like jazz, but has that kind of weirdness and quirkiness that you might hear from French New Wave, which at the time was very experimental. And so that was really a big influence into why you hear sort of a fusion jazz and also, you know, semi-classical and experimental feel.
Yeah, like I love the fact that you mentioned the fact that Ben is a cinemaphile. Like his whole thing is he is a film snob. It's not made very blatant within the film, but it's just like things that he says. And like even coming back from the beginning, where the film within a film, he's coming on, he's just like basically talking down the film's basically calling it like commercial drag, you know, commercialization drag. And then there's him and Miko is talking. And I thought it was very interesting for Randall and for the writers to reference a lot of conversations that a lot of in Asian Americans in particular would have had about Crazy Rich Asians when it came out, because for a lot of people, like, this is it's grandiose, it's big, it's expensive. But then I think there's an honesty in having the film and the character of Ben talk about the other side of that what's the word, conversation, you know, like it's a big and it's a big win for Asian American representation on screen. But then you also still got to talk about the technically cultural sacrifices that were made in the film. Like people talked about colorism within the film. Like people said, where are the dark skinned Southeast Asians, where are the, you know, so there were people that talked about that. And like Ben's character is like that. He's curmudgeon-y, he's rude, he's brash. He does not listen. This guy, oh my gosh, he does not listen. But then it's also like he's a cinephile. He's someone who loves film. He loves the theater. He's a manager of an independent theater. And like the film also talks about how these independent theaters are dying out. You know, they're gradually becoming extinct in North America. And that, I think, is informing who this character is, and you inform us who this character is through your compositions. And that's something I think that I love to pay attention to, not only as a critic, but just as a fan of film, where like I listen to the music to tell me who these characters are, because this is who Ben is. And like using like, for instance, like the jazz, and as you said, the French Nouveau, to audibly inform us who he is. It kind of tells us he's deeper than he seems. It's just that he's so caught up in his own head and in judging everyone that we don't get to see him express the deep and intelligent person he is. And you give us that through the music.
Right. And that's, that was exactly what we were going for. It's easy to judge a character like Ben, unfairly even,
Mm.
because here's this very unlikable character, right?
Very unlikable.
And I mean, I like
No,
complex characters.
it's coming from, but he's unlikable in like he's one of these people that he must always have the last word, always.
Right.
And he attacks people at their most vulnerable points.
Yeah.
He's like, if you hurt me, I'm gonna hurt you 3 times back. And I can kind of relate because I used to be kind of the same. It was very bitey, my mom would say. My mom, you're so bitey. But he's kind of like that, but he's unlikable in the sense is like, my guy, you just need to chill out. Just like relax, pull it back, pull it back.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something I love about that character, because he's more complex than what meets the eye. And I think that's really the point of the movie, is that all these characters are flawed in their own way. And Asian Americans, I think we're gradually getting away from this model minority myth, but it's been very frustrating for, say, second generation, Asian Americans like myself, in which, look, we're not all math geeks. We're not all, going to just be the buddy or whatever, and it's just so important to see our community represented in a way that's just simply normal,
Mhm.
and when you think about someone like Ben, who would be, say, fourth generation Japanese American, right? A guy like that has nothing to do with what's going on in Japan, right? Has no cultural ties there. He's as American as it gets. So why the hell should he care about something like a garish rom-com that takes place in Singapore? It's like, how is that reflective of his experience being Asian American? And so there's so many. What's beautiful about this debate is that there is no one right answer. Everybody is entitled to their own thoughts and feelings about any particular work and what it means to them. And I think all of those are valid. Who's to say, if you like Crazy Rich Asians, you must just, think that Asians are all rich and crazy, right? But there is something really to simply seeing an all Asian cast on
Mhm.
screen and being a mainstream success. And there is validity to the argument that, hey, studios can make money off of Asian actors who are simply being themselves, whether
Yeah.
they're Asian, foreign nationals, or entirely Asian Americans, which is the case with Shortcomings.
Yeah. And that's
And
the
so,
thing.
yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no! So I just wanted to address of how the music is reflecting that with Ben, is because you do have some of the curmudgeoniness of some of the, the main theme is meow,
Mm.
meow, and it literally feels like a plodding, like wah wah, type of
Yeah,
thing.
kind of.
But at the same time, it's paired with a bit of romanticism that may
Mm-hmm.
be unexpected, because it's giving him a little bit of benefit of the doubt. Like, hey, there's something more to him than just the curmudgeon-y, asshole who's needs to have the last word.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing about him is that you give him a liberty, because we're talking about his identity through the music, is like, as we've been talking about for a bit, is like there's these 3 main themes, and like when you go across to New York, you give him a separate theme in New York. Like there's New York itself has a theme, and his theme when he's in New York is like, I have it. What's it? Sorry, where's it? It's like a soft late 80s, early 90s soft rock punk song.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about that is like, I think for a lot of people, they associate New York with jazz music, because a lot of composers use jazz for New York. But you kind of switched it up, where you use jazz for the Bay Area, for Los Angeles, and you use like a soft punk rock song for New York, for Ben's song when he's there. And this is a song where he's more kind of like lost, like it feels a bit more onshore, because this is new territory for him. He's never been to New York, but he's also it's new territory for him emotionally and mentally, because he's going over there to find Miko, and also he's not going to find himself. He's just going there with an objective, but he realizes that he knows everything when he's in the Bay Area. Like he always has the last word. he knows all the history and whatever he's talking about in politics, whatever. He has a very definite idea of who he is in the Bay Area, but in New York, he doesn't know who he is. He's like a fish out of water. So I thought it was interesting that you kind of translated that in the music and you gave him a separate musical identity in the Bay Area. So talk about that theme of confusion and like being not lonely, but yeah, it's a bit lonely because he's feeling like very put aside in New York. You know, he doesn't like he feels like he's like isolated from everyone.
Right. Well, yeah, it is very interesting how New York is often associated with jazz, and you know, when the most iconic I can think of is Taxi Driver, right? Yeah. I mean, that you know, Bernard Herrmann theme, the saxophone, it's that sexy like New York, you know, sound, jazz sound. But you know, a big part of what we wanted to capture in the Bay Area was intimacy and it feeling small, and that is Ben. In that part of his life, he's like trapped in his own world and perspective, and you know, and can't get out of it. And once he gets to New York, it really starts to open up, but in a more aggressive and I would say frenetic, chaotic way, which is you know, that was something that Randall really wanted to capture when by the time we got to New York, we would feel that like anxiety start to bubble and then ultimately like let loose. And so with some of that rock stuff, I'm very much influenced by early 90s indie rock and early Radiohead. So you'll hear a lot of like tones that are referencing some of that, right? And to me,
no Radiohead. Like, okay, I'm like 39, so I get the references you're making.
Me too. Well, so so yeah, to us, it really felt like bringing in more driving energy in the form of, say, rock, you know, and then it transitions into even more frenetic, you know, very rhythmic and syncopated, you know, type of cues later on when they're in New York. But yeah, the idea was really to make the Bay Area feel small and intimate, which is why that sort of jazz combo setting of vibraphone, upright bass, some woodwinds was really appropriate for the first half of the movie. And then once we get into New York, it's a lot bigger and it starts to get bigger and then, you know, ultimately pop in a way. And so, yeah, that's sort of the basic structure of you know, why we chose a more intimate, almost jazz-like sound for the Bay Area versus a more rock, rock format when we get to New York, and not just straightforward rock. You know, it's got some clangy metallic stuff, you know, to make you feel like you're in the energy and freneticism of New York.
Yeah, and you said something that it just made me. It just clicked to my head, and you mentioned aggressive, and I was wondering, I'm like, it's aggressive. I know it's aggression, but yeah, Ben is aggressive in like his conversations with Alice and her girlfriend, and also in the scenes with Miko. Like that's where there's like this intense. It's like a building a tension. Like he's like, you know, a big argument is coming, and it is like the music has this tension that really underlies it. But then there's moments it goes completely silent. You know, there is no music. There's not even any outside sound coming from traffic or nothing. It's just them and these confrontations in the silence. But you mentioned the word aggressive, and it made me think of the scene where he goes to the club and this girl is doing the performance art. And but it made me realize I hope I get a chance to speak to Randall, because I have a question with the guy. So like they're talking about immigration. And like she's like, and it's like a white group, this white performance arts band, and the music is just kind of this death metal kind of song. And she's talking about this is what immigration sounds like. I'm like, no, because if you were an immigrant, you would know immigration sounds more like sad music. Because I'm an immigrant and I was not feeling, no, I was feeling alone and isolated and despondent. But that made me kind of think about thematically how Ben actually kind of becomes an immigrant in a sort of obscure way, where he comes from the Bay Area and he goes over to New York. But then also Alice and Miko, they themselves in a, again, obscure way, kind of become immigrants themselves, because they leave one city and they move to a completely different city. And I like how the film like talks about how like there's different ways of being an immigrant or an Asian American in America, you know, because like moving from one city to the next is a big shift. Like they move from the West Coast to the East Coast. So that literally just popped into my head as you mentioned the word aggression. I'm like, why? But then it made me think about how the film actually does this transition of moving from one place to another and forming a completely new identity. And that happens to Ben too. Like that's why the music also changes, because his identity starts to make a shift when he moves, when he doesn't move, but he goes to visit New York. So like he has an identity shift when he makes that transition.
Yes. And that is, that is directly reflected in the way that I expanded the themes, right? And so with Ben's theme, which is that sort of swooping, like, meow,
Yeah.
you'll actually hear it throughout the movie and evolve throughout as we progress. And so not only that, there's also a love theme, which is a very simple motif, is and you'll hear it, splattered throughout the score. But all of those little melodies and themes are take different shapes as we get into New York and after actually the last fight. If you really pay attention, you'll hear that the love theme is inverted.
Inverted,
and so,
yes.
And so I employ little techniques like that just to help subconsciously. It's not overt, unless you're really paying attention to it. It's just going to sound like score. But when you really do, then it does help convey exactly what you're talking about, which is this character's transformation and willingness to change. Because that's a huge critical part of this film, is that here's a guy who is just so resistant to change. And all of us, I think, can identify with that.
Yep.
This isn't specific to Asian Americans. I think this is a universal theme. And that's really all that it's conveying. It's like, hey, look, this guy, he was stuck. Now he's starting to crack open a little bit. And hey, he hasn't completely changed. But there is the potential to change, and he sees that within himself by the end of the movie.
Yeah, he's taking baby steps.
Yeah.
And like, so far we've talked about how you've kind of like done the opposite of what people would have expected for the score with regards to location. But then I think what you did was interesting is you kind of played into the sentimentality at the end. And I think and I think what you did so brilliantly with that is again, like your musical progression in the film follows very carefully the story and the evolution of Ben throughout the story. And this is where that composers work very closely, not only with the filmmakers, but also with the characters and understanding who the characters are, because and the script in particular, because there's a line that Alice tells Ben where she's like, are you going to go and do like the whole romantic comedy scene where you're going to take your bag and run down the street and have a romantic reunion? And he's like, no. And you think like, yeah, no, it's not going to happen, because that's not what this film is. This film does not play into tropes, not only just tropes of Asian Americans, but it does not play into tropes of romantic comedies. Like romantic comedies have very specific tropes and very specific formulas. But then at the end, you realize it is still supposed to be about hopeful. It's still supposed to be about hope. It's about being about Ben growing as a person and him being able to look towards a future and having a better life as a man and as a filmmaker, and also as a potential partner for someone. And I thought it was interesting. And that's where you actually make the score predictable, but not in a bad way. This is where, again, at the beginning of the interview, we talked about the orchestral piece that opens up the film, and it's the violin, and you bring it back and you make it sentimental. And then that's where it's like the soft classical music with the violins and the strings, and it's getting like big and not sappy, but it's just like, hopeful, rainbows. I can see rainbows in the future. So I want you to talk about that, because I thought that was so smart, where you're just like, we are going to actually now play into a particular kind of like trope, and you're just like, we're going to do it with the music too, because that's how the film is. Like, he has to have his happy ending too. He has to have his hopeful ending, his sunshine and his rainbows, especially with like, he's literally sitting down looking at the bay area. Like, I'm looking across the water with the flags flapping behind me. The kids are running in the park laughing. And you're like, yes, you're going to get your happy swoonful classical music too, Ben.
Yeah, I that's my favorite piece in the
I
film.
love it too, because I'm as a huge violin fan. So whenever there's like ask about violins.
Yeah, no, it's and thank you for that. I really do. That piece was very intentionally constructed. It was to convey not just like a swooping orchestral feel, because anybody can do that. It's about capturing an emotion, which is the feeling of self-acceptance, and also feeling like, hey, relax. You can also be both very intelligent, even curmudgeon-y and critical, but you can also be warm and open at the same time. And that cue for the ending was really encapsulating just everything that happened in the film in Ben's mind, not necessarily what is being conveyed to the audience, like I said, through before in the conversation, through dialogue or the script. It was really to convey like a full circle moment. Okay, we start off with, in a way, a parody, the orchestral parody, but actually that then means something else and something bigger and even more beautiful at the end of it. And so a lot of my reference points were early, or I shouldn't say early, but some of the more late romantic composers, especially French composers such as Ravel or Debussy. And there is a romanticism and lushness to it that is also very complex. And so that was really a big reference point for me to wanting to convey musically at the end in Ben's evolution, because I didn't want it to be over the top. Right. It wasn't meant to, and both Randall and I agreed, like, it shouldn't feel like some huge celebratory thing. We should leave space for just a little bit, like, is he done yet? Or like, is he really going to change? And so there's like a question mark at the end, and there's a constant push and pull between consonance and dissonance. And that's something I personally, just as a composer, have always been very interested in. I never like to be as just this straight linear, celebratory moment. I think there's it was really about capturing the complexity emotionally in the end, but also making it feel warm and inviting with a question mark and a bit of a caveat.
Yeah, because it is an open ending. Like, Ben isn't going to do a complete 180 in like one day, in the space of one day, right? Exactly. He's not going to change completely. He is a work in progress, right?
Yes.
And the other thing about that scene, not only, and like, as we said, the music isn't like overly dramatic. It's not like super sappy or anything. But the other thing is it's more relaxed, because this is the first time in the entire film that Ben is actually relaxed. He's never been, every time he's either tense, or he's like in like this very angsty stage because he's having an argument with someone, or he's being combative in a discussion, or he's like always like watching to see what people thinks about him. Like, that's another thing about Ben too. He's very self-conscious. And it's only at the very end of the film, in this moment where he has this orchestral music, where he's sitting down, relaxed, and he's enjoying the scenery. It's also, I think, the first, and it just occurred to me too, in the entire film, where we actually get a shot of the sky. Like, the camera doesn't really focus on the sky much in this film, but this is the first time, because he's sitting, so like you have the sky in the background, and it feels more open and lighter, and like feels like this is just like, okay, Ben, now you can take a breath. And the music gives that, it gives like you said, the possibility of what's next.
Right. And, there's this little moment where he's in the airplane and he's seeing this, like, the old grandma, like, crying, like, watching this movie in a movie. Right. So it's book ending. But there's this very subtle moment where there's a shot of his face, and in his eyes, you see, maybe I should just chill and let this woman, enjoy this movie that I destroyed at the beginning of my journey, right? But you see his eyes, his face recognize, okay, I can chill out here, right? I don't need to throw in my judgment or criticism in that particular moment. And that's really when the orchestral stuff starts to unfold.
Yeah, I also thought that scene was also very interesting to me in the composition, because in the way how it's framed and shot is, to me, I also saw that as what you said too, but then it also made me think of how maybe Ben was thinking, maybe I judged the film a bit too harshly.
Yeah.
Because if this is something that can make this lady cry, maybe there's something in the film that I missed, right?
Absolutely.
And he's getting to see, and like the script on the screen, on that screen, it says just beginning. And like this is a moment also for him, like you said, like this is when the orchestral piece begins to play. And it's the beginning of this piece of music, but it's also, this is when Ben really starts to think, I do need to change. This is the beginning of his change. This is also the beginning of his transition and his evolution as a person. And that's I think that's where I think Randall and Justin, and like Justin did a fantastic job. Like he's so good.
Oh, yeah.
I loved him in After Yang. Like that's the one of my favorite movies from last year. But I think like his performance and also Randall's directing and your composition really makes this character, as you said, very complex and very layered. And like this film, it is about Asian American identity, but it's also is talking, I think, a bit about for people in our 30s. I'm gonna be 40 this year, but people in our 30s, like we still have so much growing to do, right? Like we don't know everything. Like we're still maturing in many ways. We're still growing. And like even the title of the film, Shortcomings, which makes me laugh for very personal reasons, because it's something my mom says about my dad. But because he's short and his last name is Cummings. So it's like my mom calls him Shortcomings, but like the film, seriously. So like the film also talks about our own personal shortcomings, our own personal failings, and like Ben is a character where you can look and say like we all have the potential to grow, like we, like even all the characters in the film, like Alice, she had to grow up to, and Miko, she herself had to grow up to. So while it kind of also shows how characters like Ben, people like Ben, where yes, they need to mature and grow too, but the people that we think have everything together, they don't, and they themselves need to grow. Because everyone would look at the character of Miko and thinks, oh, she has her whole life together. No, she didn't. No, she's messed up too, but we just didn't know because that's not who the film was about.
Right. And it's such a universal theme, which is what I love about this film and what I loved about working on it, is because it wasn't just like about a bunch of Asians who were immigrants, or there's some elder involved, and there's a kung fu martial arts sequence or something. This was really just about normal folks in America who identify as Americans but also as Asians, but without the attachment to, like I said, some martial arts thing or being the sidekick or whatever. It just and it is something very specific. And this is important to remark on, is that in building the score, so much of it was very directly informed by my own experience, personal experience as an Asian American, second generation.
I was going to ask you that. I was going to ask you how like Korean American, especially Korean music, because Korean music has a very, not that, the thing is, I think a lot of people don't realize now is like, for me, I actually love pansori music. But I actually, because I love pansori music, like, I do not know why, but I hear pansori music and it makes me think of like some elements of Caribbean culture and Caribbean music. But then there's also like, there's like punk versions of pansori, and there's like these female groups that sing pop versions of pansori and trot music too, which I love to. Trot is hilarious to me. But like for you, like like you said, like you're using your own personal experiences as an Asian American man, as a Korean American man, to create this composition for a film that's just about people like you, a man like you who's just like, I'm Korean American, I'm Asian American, and I'm also just a regular dude who's out here making music for film. So like, what does that mean for you to be able to have a film, like to work on a film like this, and that you draw on your personal experiences, but also just to be able to say, I'm also just making this as a composer?
Yeah, well, I can tell you that this is truly a once in a lifetime experience. I hope to have it again, but it's very rare. As I'm sure many film composers can tell you, that you come across a project that is not only creatively interesting, but personally deeply meaningful. And that started really, when I read the graphic novel originally, it hit me the same way, where I just felt seen and heard in a way that I had never felt before. And that is something so many Asian Americans would say, in response to when they first read Shortcomings, the graphic novel. And composing the music for a story like this, what I brought to the table in terms of my experience as an Asian American was feeling some of the feels that Ben had, beyond his curmudgeoniness, right? Or at least in the subtext, there is a lot of internalized racism, which isn't overtly communicated in this movie, right? There's no moral sort of like lesson about internalized racism overall in this film. It's pretty tucked in there, right? We get moments and you get hints, but at least from my perspective in looking at Ben's character, that internalized racism is ever present. It is always there because we continue to be seen as the other. One of the scenes that always breaks my heart, and maybe most people might not even bat an eye to it, is when he's at this house party and he's trying to open up a beer, right? And there's some girls at the party, they're saying, oh, it's a twist off, and they're messing with him. And he's like awkwardly trying to open this bottle. And then they're like, oh, we're just messing with you, And for me, I have been in that situation where I felt like a complete outsider. I'm like the only Asian person in this party. And here I am being essentially like made fun of. Why? Like, why are they picking on me?
Well, for something as pretty as opening a bottle, where they could just help from the beginning,
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just something that really informed the emotion that I put into the music, that's directly derived from my own experience, an emotional experience. And so I think that's why you may feel a sensitivity or emotion in the scores, because that is from my own experience as well as being an Asian American man and being in situations like Ben, feeling so awkward, feeling like an outsider or being misunderstood. And so, but beyond that, being Korean, like I wasn't trying to throw in Korean music or even pansori or anything like that. As much as I love that stuff, and actually, pansori, some of those songs, which is storytelling, that's the crux of pansori, right? Some of it sounds like straight up rap battles. Just like
it sounds like a lot of them, they're arguing and they're fighting with a person. They're saying, listen, I'm recounting our history. You need to sit here and listen to everything I'm going to say. And they say it would sound like arguing, but it's an impassioned retelling of and a lot of them have like very sorrowful scenes and stories are very sad.
Yes. Yeah, us Koreans like to get melodramatic, our K-dramas and stuff. We're a very passionate people. But yeah, I continue to be a tremendous fan of that music. And the great thing about world music is that so much of it is related. Rhythm is universal. Cadences, vocal cadences are universal. Sure, the tonalities might be different, the scales might be different, but at the core, it's just about capturing the emotion and your heartbeat or the rhythm in your body, that and the drive. And so, but yeah, all those things really helped inform how we approach the music.
I love that. To me, one of the things I love about music, especially with my background, like I come from the Caribbean, and like our Caribbean music is calypso, soca, dub, with a little bit of and reggae, of course. But then when you look at how things like rap evolved, or the reggae, like spoken word evolved, all of that, and like how they all inform each other. Like for me, I love when musicians are able to like, and this was something I spoken to another composer about, Kalishan Kalashaban, where we were talking about how, especially for ethnic composers and ethnic musicians and people of color like us, where we grew up having to use westernized instruments and adapt it to our own music, and we adapt our music to that. And it shows to me, I always think like people of color in particular I think we look at music, even like filmmaking and telling stories and composing films very differently to white people, because we're able to bring a more broader perspective and a broader experience to these things, like you as an Asian American man, like you brought your experience and being able to relate to the character of Ben, and being able to say, like, I can envision listening to this character having his theme be jazz music,
Yeah.
and it's about throwing off expectations, because there will be people who would listen to going to this film thinking they're expecting, like, quote unquote Asian sounding music.
Yeah.
And you're like, no, you're going to get classical music. You're going to get jazz. You're going to
Yes.
get punk, and you're going to get rock and all of this. And it's about showing how, for me, people of color are, like, we are a spectrum. We have all of this stuff, like, literally, to use the rainbow spectrum of experience and perspectives to bring to our crafts, to bring to our stories and how we relate to. Like, this is a film about an Asian American man, but I relate to it. I relate to Ben because he's kind of like me, but I can also relate to, like, Miko, and I can relate to how the film is talking about all the ways that we are othered in like North America in particular, like the scene with the twisted bottle cap. I moved here, and, like, in Barbados, we don't have twist caps. All of our bottles are open with bottle openers. So, like, I had a similar experience with, like, trying to open a bottle. They're like, oh, twist it. I'm like, you could have told me that from the beginning. So I very much relate to that, and so it's about showing how we are more than our shortcomings. Yes, I'm going to use the pun and say we are more than our shortcomings.
Indeed. Yeah, no, I thank you for saying that. It's just so important, because especially for future storytellers and future directors, like, as an Asian American composer, I'm one of few in this field. This field is dominated by a certain type, right? I'll just say that way. And there aren't a ton of us. And I just hope that there will be more opportunities for people like me to just be seen like everybody else as a creative, and not just like an Asian composer who has to just do Asian movies because we, maybe can make Asian music. I don't know the first thing about making Asian music.
What does that even mean?
What does it even mean? You're right. Korean music, Japanese, or Chinese, like kabuki, whatever, right? Pantori. Like, I that's not my experience. That's not my background. And so I really hope, and I applaud Randall and his team so much for being so intentional about bringing in folks below the line who represent our community, because we bring our experience into the story in service of authenticity, not just because we can do a martial arts sequence or because maybe we can make something Asian sounding, right? No. As Asian Americans, we bring our perspective into a story. And I hope that future Asian American creatives and filmmakers can be more relaxed about accepting this reality.
Yeah, no, that's true. And yes, and also there's applause to you too, because you did a fantastic job.
Oh, thank you so much, Carol.
Yeah, no, I generally really, I honestly truly genuinely enjoy this conversation, and I love your perspective on the music and, like, how you saw the character of Ben, because it's about bringing I think for me, for, like, composers have to generally, like, for me anyway, you generally appreciate the character of Ben, and you wanted the audience to love him more than he possibly loved himself, and that comes through in the music, because you're taking time to, like, give this character his own story and his own soundtrack of life. I wish we all had our soundtracks, but like, like, we always say, what would my soundtrack sound like? But, like, he has his, and, like, he can be like his soundtrack could be yours, or it could be Randall's, or Justin who plays Ben. Like, it could be anyone's soundtrack, and it can be something that everyone, like, they can relate to.
Definitely. Yeah.
And this was great.
I loved this. It's been such a joy to speak with you, Carolyn, and I just really appreciate your perspective and openness, and you're just so informed about just so many different kinds of music, and I just really appreciate your commentary and what you picked up on. There's nothing more meaningful and than having someone like you just pick up on these things that you just hope, will people notice?
Yeah.
And so thank you so much.
Thank you. You're welcome. It was my pleasure. And I just had a thought, and it flickered away. I don't know where it went.
Well, anytime,
Again, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me, Jean. This is great. And congratulations on the film. And I don't know if when is going to get a theatrical release, but I can't wait to see what other people think about it, because I'm sure everyone will love it.
Me too. Well, I certainly hope so. And even if they hate it, it's a conversation starter.
At least I like it. Everyone else can hit me. You can at least know Carolyn likes it.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I love it.
Directed by Randall Park, which premiered at the 2023 Sundance Film Festival. I had a great time talking with Gene and learning about how he interpreted the character of Ben through the music and giving him his own personal identity and theme and sound, and I guess you could say color as a character. And I'm sure this film will also create a lot of discussions once it's released in theaters. I personally very much enjoyed it. And I think Justin H. is a fantastic actor. Like, he was in Umbrella Academy on Netflix. He was also in After Yang, directed by Coconada, which released at Sundance last year. And I had, that's one of my favorite films from 2022. And it's great to see that Justin is branching out as an actor, and that he has a project like Shortcomings, where he gets to work with someone like Randall Park, but also have a composer like Gene, who's like paying so much attention to the work that he's doing as an actor and the character that he's playing. And this was, I can't say honestly, I had a really great time talking to Gene and listening to him and listening to what he had to say about his work and his perspective. And congrats to him and everyone that worked on the film. And you can listen to more episodes of Carolyn Talks here on whichever podcast streaming website you're listening to, and is under my podcast. So Here's What Happened, that I host with my friend Anisha Campbell, where we discuss films, TV shows, books, mangas, comics, and all forms of entertainment in various genres monthly. And you can also go to my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/@Carolyn_Hines and watch this interview in video format, as well as my other coverage from Sundance and TIFF of 2022, as well as Sundance from 2022, and other interviews that I do for Carolyn Talks, as well as for the African American Film Critics Association for our virtual roundtables. You can go to my R3 page, that's AUTHORY.com/Carolyn Hines, CarolynHinds, to find all of my written work, reviews, interviews, film analysis, profiles, reports are all published there. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at CarrieCNH12, that's CarrieCNH12, and follow me there. And I also co-host a Saturday Night Sci-Fi. That's a live tweet session every Saturday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. Me and my co-host, we host a session where we live tweet films and TV shows from around the world in the sci-fi genre. And you can also go to Gene's website. That's Gene Back, BACK music.com to learn more about Gene and his music and the projects that he's worked on. And I think I'm going to wrap up here, everyone. So until the next episode of Carolyn Talks, stay safe. Bye.